The night my husband handed me divorce papers at our 10th anniversary dinner, he was smiling like he'd already won. He hadn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because the beginning matters. It always does. Derek and I met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in Austin. He was charming in that easy, unforced way that makes you think you found someone rare. He laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them. He held doors open without thinking about it. He called his mother every Sunday. I thought I'd hit some kind of jackpot the night he asked for my number, and for years, real, actual years, I believed that. We got married when I was 29. Small ceremony, outdoor venue, string lights in the oak trees. My mother cried. His father gave a toast that made the whole room laugh. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the life I was supposed to have. The first few years were good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but genuinely good. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with a big backyard and a porch swing we never used enough. I worked as a project manager at a mid-size marketing firm. Derek ran his own landscaping and outdoor design company that he'd built from almost nothing, and I was proud of him for it. We talked about kids eventually, about a bigger house eventually, about a lot of things that lived comfortably in the word eventually. I can't pinpoint the exact moment things changed. That's the thing nobody tells you about a marriage falling apart. It rarely happens in one dramatic scene. It happens in increments. A comment here, a dismissal there. A slow accumulation of small humiliations that you convince yourself don't add up to anything real. The comments started around year 6. Nothing I could easily call out, nothing that would sound serious if I tried to describe it to someone else. Derek would glance at what I was wearing before we went out and say something like, "Is that what you're going with?" Not a question. A verdict. I'd change, and he'd seem satisfied, and I'd tell myself he just had strong opinions about presentation, that we were a couple with standards. Then his college friend Brandon started coming around more. Brandon had known Derek since freshman year at UT. They'd drifted apart for a while after college, the way people do, but reconnected a few years into our marriage when Brandon moved back to Austin after a divorce of his own. He started showing up at our house on weekends. He and Derek would sit on the back patio with beers and talk for hours while I moved around the kitchen or the living room, not quite included, not quite excluded, just there. Brandon was the kind of man who thought being blunt was the same thing as being honest. He'd make a comment about a restaurant I suggested. That place is kind of basic, don't you think? And then look at Derek with this slight lift of his eyebrow, and Derek would shrug and say nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I told myself Brandon was just abrasive, that it wasn't personal, that Derek didn't agree with him. He just didn't like confrontation. What I didn't tell myself, because I wasn't ready to hear it, was that Derek had started agreeing with Brandon about me in private long before he started agreeing with him out loud. I found out by accident, the way these things usually happen. It was a Tuesday evening in March, about 8 months before our 10th anniversary. Derek had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to take a shower. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was walking past it on my way to get a glass of water when it lit up with a message from Brandon. The preview was just long enough to read before the screen dimmed. She still has no idea, right? Dude, the look on her face is going to be priceless. I stood there in the kitchen with a glass of water I didn't remember pouring, reading those words 3 times. Then I picked up the phone. Derek hadn't locked it, he never did at home, because he'd always told me he had nothing to hide. The thread between him and Brandon went back weeks. I scrolled slowly, reading everything, my hands very steady in a way that felt strange to me even in the moment. There was something almost clinical about how calm I was, like some part of my brain had already suspected this and was simply receiving confirmation rather than news. The plan was laid out in pieces across dozens of messages. Derek had consulted a lawyer. He'd been moving money quietly, in small amounts out of our joint account and into a business account I wasn't on. He'd been documenting irreconcilable differences with the lawyer's guidance, building a paper case. And the delivery method the moment he'd chosen to hand me the divorce papers was our 10th anniversary dinner. A dinner at Rosewood, the upscale restaurant downtown where we'd had our first official date. He'd already invited both our families and a group of friends under the pretense of celebrating the milestone. Brandon's idea, apparently. Make it public, Brandon had written. She's going to fall apart. Cry, beg, make a scene, and everyone will see who she really is. You'll look like the reasonable one walking away. Derek had responded with a laughing emoji. I put the phone back exactly where it had been. I walked to the living room. I sat down on the couch. I could hear the shower running down the hall. I sat there for a long time, and I thought very clearly about what I was going to do. The first thing I did was nothing. I let Derek come out of the shower, make a joke about a client who'd called 3 times that afternoon, eat the dinner I'd already started making, and watch television until we went to bed. I said goodnight. I turned out my lamp. I lay in the dark beside this man I'd spent a decade building a life with, and I started planning. The second thing I did was call my friend Patrice. Patrice had been my closest friend since college. She was also, conveniently, a family law attorney who had spent 15 years handling exactly the kind of situation I was now standing in the middle of. I called her from my car in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 days later while Derek thought I was running errands. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." What followed was 8 months of the most deliberate, focused, careful work I have ever done in my life. Patrice walked me through everything: community property laws in Texas, what Derek was legally entitled to and what he wasn't, the financial moves he'd been making and what they actually constituted under state law, which, as it turned out, included something that rhymed with fraud. She connected me with a forensic accountant named Roy, a quiet, meticulous man who could trace every dollar Derek had shifted over the past 2 years. I opened my own accounts. I secured copies of every financial document I could access: tax returns, mortgage statements, business records Derek had stored in the shared drive on the home computer he never thought to lock me out of. I documented everything. Every account, every transfer, every discrepancy Roy identified. I did all of this quietly, calmly, while continuing to be a perfectly ordinary wife. I made Derek's coffee in the morning. I asked about his projects. I sat next to him at Brandon's 4th of July cookout and laughed at the right moments and gave no indication whatsoever that I knew what was coming or that I had been spending my lunch breaks in Patrice's conference room, reviewing discovery documents. There were moments that were harder than others. One evening in July, Derek came home from what he said was a late client meeting. He smelled like bourbon and someone else's cologne, not his own brand, something sharper. I noticed. I filed it away. Brandon's wife, ex-wife, technically had told a mutual friend that the reason their marriage ended was that Brandon had been carrying on a long-term affair with someone in his social circle who had been right under her nose the whole time. I thought about that comment more than once over those 8 months. I didn't confront Derek about the smell. I wasn't there to save the marriage. I was there to finish what he'd started, but on my terms. In September, I got a call from my mother-in-law, Diane. She was sweet, genuinely sweet, one of those women who makes everyone in a room feel individually attended to. She called to say she was so excited about the anniversary dinner Derek had put together. Wasn't it just the most romantic thing? And could I tell her what I was planning to wear so she could coordinate colours for photos? I told her I was thinking of wearing something silver. She said that sounded beautiful. I didn't tell her that I'd known about the dinner since March. I didn't tell her what was actually going to happen at it. Diane was collateral, someone who loved her son and didn't know what he was, and I didn't have any interest in hurting her before I had to. The dinner was scheduled for the 2nd Saturday of October. Rosewood, 8 o'clock, private dining room. Derek had reserved it for 22 people. I'd found the reservation confirmation in his email, which he had foolishly connected to our shared family calendar years ago and never disconnected. The week before, Patrice and I met at her office for what she called the final walkthrough. Roy had completed his analysis. The documentation was organized in a manila folder, tabbed and indexed. There was a second document, a separate, smaller envelope that Patrice slid across the table to me last. "This is for Brandon specifically," she said. I looked at it. "Are we sure?" I asked. "Roy found it on his own," she said. "We didn't go looking. It's solid." I picked up the envelope and held it for a moment. Then I put it in my bag. On the evening of the dinner, I took a long shower. I did my hair the way Derek had always told me he loved, which I'd stopped doing around year 7 because he'd stopped noticing. I wore a silver dress I'd bought 3 weeks earlier, tailored specifically. I wore heels I could walk confidently in and a pair of earrings my grandmother had left me. I looked in the mirror for a long time before I left. I looked like someone who had everything under control, because I did. I arrived at Rosewood at 7:55. The private room was already filling up. I saw Derek's parents near the far wall, Diane in blue. His father Tom shaking hands with someone. I saw my own parents by the door, my mother in the cream blouse she wore to every occasion she considered important. My father with his hand on the small of her back, the way he'd stood for 40 years. I saw a cluster of Derek's friends near the bar, people I'd had dinners with, spent holidays with, considered part of my life. I saw Brandon. He was standing to the left of the head table, holding a whiskey, talking to Derek in a low voice. When I walked in, they both looked up. Brandon's expression did something subtle, a slight shift, a recalibration, and then he smiled the smile of a man who believes he holds every card. Derek crossed the room to greet me. He kissed my cheek. He smelled like the bourbon again. "You look great," he said. "Thank you," I said. We sat down to dinner. I want you to understand what it took to sit through that dinner. The appetizers, the bread, the main course arriving in careful sequence, while people around me laughed and clinked glasses, and my husband spoke warmly about a decade of partnership and how much he valued everything we'd built together. I spoke when spoken to. I smiled at my mother-in-law across the table. I was, by every outward measure, a woman having a lovely anniversary dinner, and I waited. The dessert plates had just been cleared when Derek stood up. He tapped his glass. The room settled. He began with a speech. A real speech. Prepared, with pauses in the right places. He talked about when we met, about early years, about growth and change, and how marriages evolve. He was good at it, I'll give him that. My mother was already reaching for her napkin. Then his hand went to the inside of his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded envelope and set it on the table in front of me. "I think we both know," he said quietly, the warmth gone from his voice, "that this has been coming for a while." The room went very still. My mother's napkin stopped moving. I looked at the envelope. I looked up at Derek. I could see Brandon to his left, leaning slightly forward, jaw tight, waiting. I reached out and picked up the envelope. I opened it. Inside were the divorce papers, exactly as I'd known they would be. I scanned the first page, his signature already on the bottom line, a blank space waiting for mine. I reached into my purse and took out a pen. I heard someone at the table draw a sharp breath. My mother, I think, or maybe Diane. I found the signature line, and I signed my name, clearly, deliberately, one clean stroke. I set the pen down and looked up at Derek. His expression had gone uncertain for the first time all evening. "Thank you," I said. "This actually saves us both some time." I reached into my purse again and took out 2 envelopes. One was thick, cream-coloured, the kind that holds documents. The other was smaller, white, plain. I handed the thick one to Derek. I handed the smaller one to Brandon. "What is this?" Derek asked. "That," I said, "is a copy of the forensic accounting report that documents approximately $340,000 in marital assets you transferred out of community property over the past 2 years. Along with Patrice Holloway's contact information, she's my attorney. She's expecting your lawyer's call on Monday." The colour in Derek's face did something interesting. "And," I said, "a copy of the original divorce, filing my attorney submitted yesterday, which supersedes the one you just handed me, and includes a claim for full restitution of the transferred assets, plus penalties." I paused. Texas law is actually quite specific about this kind of thing. Roy, he's the forensic accountant, was very thorough. Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I looked at Brandon. "Open yours," I said. He didn't move. "Brandon," my voice was perfectly level. "Open the envelope." He opened it. I watched him read. I watched the whiskey glass lower slowly from his lips. I watched the specific expression that crosses a person's face when they realize the floor has just disappeared beneath them. "Those," I said, "are financial records from Clearwater Outdoor Group, the commercial property investment company you've been operating quietly for the past 3 years, which Derek has been a silent partner in without disclosing it to the IRS or to the 3 clients whose investment funds you appear to have redirected into it." Patrice passed the file to a contact at the DA's office last Wednesday. I tilted my head slightly. I didn't go looking for it. The accountant found it on his own while pulling Derek's records. Funny how that works. The room was absolutely silent. Somewhere near the far wall, I heard my father put down his glass. I picked up the signed divorce papers, folded them, and placed them neatly in my purse. I gathered my clutch. I stood up from the table. 10 years, I said to Derek, not bitterly, not with tears, just as a fact, the way you'd state the weather. I made you coffee every morning for 10 years. I straightened my dress. I walked out of the private dining room of Rosewood on a Saturday night in October, through the main restaurant, past a hostess who smiled at me, through the front door and into the cool air outside. My heels made a clean sound on the stone steps. The street was quiet. A couple walked past holding hands. A cab idled at the corner. I stood on the sidewalk and took one long breath, and it was the cleanest breath I had taken in 8 months. Patrice called me the following Thursday to let me know Derek's attorney had been in contact. The tone of the conversation, she said, had been notably cooperative. The asset case was resolved 4 months later. The settlement, including the returned community property, penalties, and legal fees, came to just over $400,000. The house went on the market in January. I'd already put a deposit on an apartment near downtown with a balcony that caught the afternoon sun. Brandon's situation took longer and went further. The DA's office pursued the case through the following spring. Roy's documentation held up entirely. Brandon and a third partner, who I'd never met, ultimately pled out. It wasn't 5 years, it was more. Derek never remarried. Last I heard, he and Brandon had a falling out sometime after the legal proceedings began. I didn't follow the details closely. It wasn't really my story anymore. My mother called me the Monday after the dinner. She said she was proud of me. She said it in the careful, understated way my mother says things that matter to her, which meant she meant it completely. My father, when I went to their house for Sunday dinner the following week, poured me a glass of wine without being asked and said, "You handled that beautifully." I didn't meet anyone new for almost a year, and that was exactly right. I needed to live alone in my apartment with the afternoon balcony and remember who I was before I started measuring myself against someone else's opinion of me. I read books I'd been meaning to read. I took a weekend trip to Santa Fe with Patrice and her sister. I started a garden container pots on the balcony, tomatoes and herbs, and found that I was actually good at keeping things alive. I thought sometimes about the moment I'd stood in the kitchen holding Derek's phone, about how still I'd been, about the choice I'd made in that stillness not to scream, not to confront, not to beg for an explanation, but to think carefully about what I actually wanted. What I'd wanted was not to save the marriage. What I'd wanted was to not be humiliated. To not be the woman who fell apart in a restaurant while her husband watched. To not be the outcome Brandon had described to Derek in a text message with a laughing emoji. I'd wanted to walk out of that room on my own terms. And I had. The balcony garden did better than I expected. The tomatoes took a while, but by the following July they were coming in faster than I could use them. I'd take bags of them down to the older woman on the second floor, Mrs. Aldridge, who had lived in the building for 20 years and made a green tomato relish she'd bring back up to me in small mason jars. We'd sit on my balcony sometimes in the evenings when the heat broke, and she'd tell me stories about her own life, the things she'd walked through, the things that had surprised her, the things that hadn't. She told me once that the most useful thing she'd ever learned was the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting, she said, is what they expect. Responding is what you choose. I thought about that for a long time. I still do. There's a question I get sometimes, from friends, from my sister, from people who've heard some version of the story secondhand. Wasn't I angry? And the answer is yes. Of course I was angry. For 8 months I carried an anger that I kept so carefully banked and contained that sometimes I wasn't sure it was still there until I'd lie awake at 3 a.m. and feel it sitting in my chest like something solid and warm. But I'd made a decision early on that I wasn't going to let the anger make my choices, that I was going to let it fuel the work instead. Every time I sat across a conference table from Patrice reviewing documents I didn't want to know existed, every time I smiled across the dinner table at a man who was planning to humiliate me, every time I drove home from a meeting with Roy and sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside, I thought about that anger, and I thanked it, and I told it. Not yet. Wait. It waited. And when the moment came, it turned out I didn't even need it. I just needed the documents and the pen and the 2 envelopes and the absolute, settled calm of a woman who had already decided what she was worth. I'm 38 now. My apartment has a 2nd bedroom. I've turned into a home office. I was promoted to director at the firm last spring. The balcony garden is on its third season, and I've learned to extend the growing window with a small cold frame Patrice's husband helped me build. Missus. Aldridge and I still trade tomatoes for relish, and sometimes she stays for a second glass. Some nights I sit out there after dark, and the city makes its low, ambient sound. And I think about 10 years of a life I built with someone who ultimately didn't deserve it. I don't think about it with bitterness anymore. I think about it the way you think about a hard season, something that shaped you in ways you wouldn't have chosen but can't honestly regret. I think about the kitchen and the phone and the decision I made in the stillness. I think about Rosewood on a Saturday night in October, and the 2 envelopes in my purse, and the clean sound of my heels on the stone steps. I think about the breath I took on the sidewalk, and then I top off my wine, and I look out at the city, and I feel exactly like what I am, a woman who responded when everyone expected her to react, and who has been living freely ever since. What would you have done if you'd found those messages on his phone? Think about it, because the answer matters more than you might think. Like and subscribe to Frost Revenge for more stories of women who chose to respond. The next one is coming soon, and trust me, you're going to want to be here for it.